Okay, so we're going to dive into part 3 as we look closer at culturally responsive PBIS. So here we're going to dive a little deeper into our next component of culturally responsive PBIS. Remember, there are those 5 core components. So we are going to look at supportive environment, that third component. We've already now looked at identity and voice. So when we look at supportive environment, we want to align TFI feature 1.2, team operating procedures, with this. And what does this mean? We speak about this in our general PBIS training as being, we talk about teams who have defined roles, consistent procedures. You know this, we talk about how we function in our PBIS team. The culturally responsive elaboration speaks about the fact that our team procedures include structures and practices that prompt the use of data for decision making and communication, and we advocate for that transparency of the system, and we enable all stakeholders to have a voice in the process and outcomes. And that during that data analysis, team members examine the systems and policies for potential changes, as opposed to just placing the responsibility for change on families and students, right? And we have a defined set of procedures within our team meetings that hold all members responsible for ensuring equitable PBIS implementation. We assess student data as well for equitable impact, right? So this might sound familiar anyway, it's just an elaboration. You know that our PBIS teams are data-informed decision-making teams. So this probably sounds quite familiar, although it extends it beyond just that basic expectation that we speak about in our trainings. Again, within supportive environment, they align 1.6, discipline policies. We generally speak about 1.6 as referring to proactive and instructive responses to problem behavior, and that they lead to more improved student outcomes, right? As opposed to just those exclusionary practices that we currently have in place. So when we elaborate on this, we talk about teams employing and supporting an instructional approach to discipline that emphasizes teaching pro-social skills as opposed to just looking at exclusionary discipline, right? So as a team, we'll ask ourselves, if we see certain data and we're analyzing it, we won't just look at, what can we do, to instruct students, but we look also at our policies, our practices. We look at opportunities for teaching. We look for where there might be disparate impact, and from a power versus purpose perspective, right? What does that mean? For example, policies and practices that reflect the preferences of staff versus those with a clear purpose linked to our educational outcomes. So as a team, we want to make sure when we are suggesting solutions to some of the problems or some of what's revealed in our data, we want to look not just at punitive, right? So we have punitive practices in place in our school systems, and we know that's a part of our discipline guidelines, our code of conduct. But we want to look for opportunities for instruction, right? How can we reinforce pro-social skills? How can we reinforce the teaching and reteaching of skills? And how can we involve our students as well in that process so that their voice is heard as well? Once again, for supportive environment, we're going to look at 1.9 aligned with this component, which is feedback and acknowledgement. We usually speak about this in the context of our acknowledgement systems, right? So how are we going to set up a system and an opportunity for staff to acknowledge students, right, and their positive behavior? So we elaborate on this to speak about how we involve students, families, and communities in the development and use of acknowledgement systems so that we create an acknowledgement system that is meaningful and authentic. We consider the culture of the students and our families when we design our recognition systems, and we work with the assumption that we believe that learning a new skill requires additional reinforcement, particularly when habits are formed. So when we look at our data and realize that we might have some issues with particular behavior, we look at the opportunity where we can acknowledge, the expected opposite positive behavior, right? And we involve our students, families, and communities in developing any kind of acknowledgement system we have. So for example, the positive office referral, right, that we might have at a particular school, we look to see if we can get feedback from our students to find out if this is something that students would respond to, if it's responsive to students and their cultures as well. And sometimes students and families will come up with some amazing ways to build a culture of affirmation and acknowledgement. So we want to take it out of just looking at a token system, right, where we have to give kids these tickets or tokens when they do something right, right? That's where PBIS sometimes falls into that myth where that's all it's about. But it's really, how do we create a culture of affirmation, right? And how can we encourage that? And that might look a little different than just handing out a positive office referral. It might be creating opportunities for families to actually showcase ways to encourage students and build that culture of affirmation as well, and how to communicate with families about what students are doing well in school and how to encourage that communication as well. So thinking outside of the box here. So we want to ask in our discussion question 12, reflecting on these last 3 TF5 features that we just aligned to supportive environment, which aspect do you feel will be the easiest to develop, and which do you feel will be the hardest? And just share why you think that might be the case. All right, we're going to keep talking about supportive environment, but we've pulled this one out separately because it is very interesting to kind of break down. And if you did look at the cultural responsiveness field guide, you'll see that this one can look a little complicated. And this refers to 1.8 classroom procedures being aligned to supportive environment. And the reason why we need to tackle this one separately is because this embodies all of those classroom practices that we spoke to you all about. And those are those 8 classroom practices that range from classroom expectations to procedures and routines to that feedback, right? Verbal feedback to physical arrangement, right? So you remember talking about all of those practices. So we've talked about those in training, but the elaboration speaks about how the team supports classroom teachers in the implementation of PBIS in the classrooms. Routines and expectations are taught explicitly. They're connected to those school-wide systems and students' prior knowledge and home lives, right? So we take that into account. Classroom teachers using the VAB approach, and I'll speak about that in a minute, ensure that all students in the class can see their lives, histories, and cultures and home languages incorporated into the classroom environment, or I should say learning environment in general, the curricula, and the instructional practices on a daily basis. Now that is a mouthful right there. So let's break that down because we want to look at what that VAB approach really means, because that speaks to this particular feature 1.8. So VAB stands for validation, affirmation, building, and bridging, right? It's a set of strategies that can be used by staff to facilitate code switching by their students in relation to the students and families served by the school. And what does code switching mean? Of course, you can Google it, but code switching, right, means that the way in which I might interact, right, or make decisions or speak or the way I might be in a certain setting in my home environment, right, or in my neighborhood might be different than what is expected in the school setting, right? And so then I have to switch, right? How I interact, how I conduct myself, right? So that's that code switching. And oftentimes for our students, our Black and brown students, our students of color, right? There is a greater shift that they have to make, right? Between their home and community environment and coming into school. And so that's where that term code switching comes from. And you can look a little deeper into that on your own as well. So what does that first letter stand for? What does it mean, validation? It's legitimizing the aspects of students' cultures, right, that have historically been seen as illegitimate by the dominant culture. So we intentionally allow time and space for cultural aspects within the school day. These cultural aspects include language, teachings, and rites of passage, right? So thinking about what the cultures of students are and being able to validate that culture within the school setting. And they give an example in the cultural responsiveness field guide. It's just one example. It's not exhaustive, but they talk about acknowledging that these cultural aspects play a prominent role in students' lives. And they speak about rap music, right? Having that negative connotation based on dominant culture, right? However, rap music can be seen as an effective form of communication that requires creativity and spontaneity. Right? So strategies for validation might include displaying aspects of students' culture in the classroom and around the school, asking students to share their experiences, as well as families, right? And listening non-judgmentally. So on our next discussion question 13, consider your middle or high school experience. Did you feel that your culture was validated in class and throughout the school? All right, let's look at that second letter, affirmation. So affirmations is explicitly acknowledging the worth of students' cultures and learning histories, right? And so back to that same example, rap music, right? If it's an aspect of student culture at a school, affirmation requires harnessing and capitalizing on the communication, creativity, and spontaneity of that particular music, right? And so this is where acknowledging, right, and affirming students' lived experiences matters, right? This is where we're probably familiar as educators in thinking about how, when we think about our content and our pedagogy, our teaching it within the classroom, thinking about how can we bring the lived experiences of our students into the classroom, right? Because it can range. We have so many different students. We have a diverse population oftentimes in our classrooms. So how do we bring their lived experiences in? So strategies for affirmation include accepting a wider range of acceptable behavior possibly than the dominant culture often allows. Stating the positive intent of students' behaviors when trying to influence them for situational appropriateness, right? So holding those high expectations for each student, but understanding that when we see a student displaying certain behavior, it might be acceptable possibly in another setting, but not in the classroom setting, right? So acknowledging it not as wrong and bad, but not appropriate for that particular setting. So in this discussion, question 14, consider the phrase just shared. Stating the positive intent of students' behaviors when trying to shape them for situational appropriateness, and holding high expectations for each student. So how can this be integrated into professional learning for the two particular classroom practices related to behavior feedback? And we've adjusted the terminology on this recently. You know it to be behavior-specific praise and error correction that we spoke about in training. We've just rephrased them to be anchored to behavior feedback. So one is acknowledgement, right, which you knew as praise, and then one is error correction. And these are also linked within the Schoology group below this video. So feel free to look at these two. How can this concept be integrated into our professional learning for these two classroom practices? Because this is some of what our work will be as we work with staff moving forward. Let's look at this next letter, building. Building is providing specific instruction regarding why certain student behaviors are necessary in certain school settings. Strategies for building include teaching expectations in each setting instead of assuming students know them, right? Teaching that code switching, just meaning teaching that expectation and why it's necessary in that particular setting, but why it might be okay in another setting, and describing unwanted behaviors as not for school as opposed to wrong, right? So in our next discussion, question 15, consider the phrase just shared. Teaching code switching and describing unwanted behaviors as not for school as opposed to wrong. This is a big statement to say. So how can this be integrated into professional learning for the classroom practice related to corrective behavior feedback? All right, and that last letter, bridging. Bridging is giving the student opportunities to practice and build fluency in certain school behaviors, those expectations, with some feedback, right, from the educator. So strategies include lessons and booster lessons, possibly for active practice of school behaviors. Teachers often do this every day where we're practicing certain expectations or practicing maybe what's expected during independent work or what's expected during group work. And we acknowledge students regularly for following those expectations and provide encouraging, skill-based, non-judgmental corrections when needed. And this kind of ties into that SEL. Right? How do we provide encouraging feedback that is tied to some of that self-awareness, social awareness, right? Social interaction. How do we provide feedback that is based on those skills that are needed in that setting? In the next discussion, question 16, consider the phrase just shared, providing encouraging, skill-based, non-judgmental corrections when needed. How can this be integrated into professional learning for the classroom practice related to corrective behavior feedback, the one we just looked at in the last question, error correction? So check that out. How can we consider this particular phrase and encourage this in our professional learning with staff?